Night Chill Audiobooks presents Burnt Offerings, written in 1973 by Robert Marasco, read by James Ross Spencer. Burnt Offerings, Chapter 1. Not so fast, sweetheart. Back. David ate, stopped halfway across the living room, drew his shoulders up as though something sharp was about to hit him, and then turned slowly. Marion was standing in the small foyer in the rear of the apartment, between the two bedrooms. Her arm went up like a semaphore, pointing toward his room. "That room was spotless when you came in," she said. "Remember?" He dragged his feet over the rug and the wood floor she had just finished polishing. His sneakers made small, rubbery sounds. "Feet, please," Marion said as he walked past her. She followed him. "See what I mean?" David pulled his school shirt off the doorknob, opened the closet, and reached up for a hanger. "I forgot," he said lamely. "For a smart kid, you forget an awful lot." She watched him stab at the shirt with the hanger. "If you put the pants on first, you save a hanger. No?" "Oh, the pants too." "Of course the pants too, and the shoes." His pants were on the floor next to a chair. He scooped them up and started to stuff one leg through the hanger. "Honey," Marion said patiently. He lowered the hanger emphatically. "I can't do it when you're watching me. I get nervous." "Then I won't watch you." She turned her back to him, facing the windows. "Say when." She could hear him muttering above the sounds rising from the courtyard 3 stories below. She moved toward the windows and adjusted the rings of the red cafe curtains, which had been drawn against the glare of the apartment house directly opposite, a wall of glass and smooth white brick. Marion heard a loud female voice scream, "Darlene!" in the courtyard. She leaned closer to the window and looked down. It was a fairly large concrete area with vague grass borders, primarily a passageway lined with benches, to the entrances of the multi-winged building 10 yards away. From 3 to 5 especially, the benches were filled with women, young mothers mostly, each of them with a baby carriage within reach. She heard the cry, "Darlene!" again, louder, and saw a young woman in shorts and a sleeveless blouse spring up. She was pointing at someone out of range. "Now you're really gonna get it." 2 carriages parted to let her pass. She ran out of sight, and from the shriek that followed, Darlene had really gotten it. The week had been unseasonably warm. 76 today and only mid-May, and the courtyard, as it did each spring, had blossomed into a swirling, echoing playground. With summer, the hours would lengthen and the din become impossible. Summer. Apartment. Queens. The overtones were ominous. Again. She sneaked a look at David. He replaced the hanger, which now listed heavily, and slipped his school shoes into the shoe bag. As he did, a piano started in the apartment below. 3:30. She could set her watch by it. Scales first, struggling for traction for about 5 minutes or so, then a leap into Bach or Beethoven or whatever 2D was working on this month. 3:30 to 5. 5 days a week. The clinkers will still be there at the end of the month, but faster, louder, more practiced. Like that one. She winced. "Oh, and that." On a scale, for God's sake. Well, there was no point in complaining again, because the lease says very clearly 9 to 9. so she would smile and just walk heavy. David slammed the closet door shut and challenged her with an arms akimbo. Okay? Okay, she said. She moved across the red shag rug in the middle of the room and crouched in front of him. Looks better, doesn't it? Admit it. He wouldn't. It looked fine before. She tucked his t-shirt in, then pulled him toward her and kissed his face loudly. I'm a problem, I know, she said, sympathetically, but you're not so easy yourself. He tried to pull away. I'm going to be late. Late for what? Things. So be late. The only time I get to see you is when I'm yelling at you. That's why I yell so much. Impatiently, he let her smooth down his hair, which was thick and dark, like Ben's. Hers was long and dark blonde, and once just after she had turned 30 last year, there had been a single strand of gray, which she had yanked out. No bike on the boulevard, remember, and home by 6. That's S-I-X, 6, got it? Now kiss, please. He barely kissed her on the cheek and reanimated now, bolting from the room. Marian sat back on her heels and waited for the door to slam shut and rattle the windows. The room was back in order, temporarily. A magazine view of what a boy's room should be, with peanut pillows arranged neatly on the bedspread, a small desk bookcase unit highly polished, football posters and antique gun prints. Daffy Duck hung evenly over the bed. A model frigate was on the bureau, and scattered around the room were a model Mustang and Dracula and Mummy and a mechanical Frankenstein who dropped his pants and blushed, from Aunt Elizabeth, who had one just like it. They had all been dusted, and the room smelled fresh and oiled, like the whole apartment. The door slammed, and the curtains billowed slightly. Marian was playing idly with a pile of the rug. She could feel the floor vibrating with the sound of the piano below. Her impulse was to hammer, but it was embarrassing enough already to run into the woman in the hall at the mailbox. She found a white thread and picked at it, then a bit of soot which smeared her fingers, and then leaning forward on her knees now and digging under the pile, a small patch of blue fiber, the color of her bedroom rug. Empty the vacuum, she reminded herself. She spread her hand over the rug, straightening the pile, then stood up, went to the closet, and rehung David's clothes. For a minute or so, she just stared into the closet. The scales below had finally become Bach, and maybe she liked 2D's Bach after all, because something in the melody moved her to touch David's suit jacket and his raincoat, and the ratty blue bathrobe which she had to force herself to replace someday. The feel of it and the melody below, clinkers and all, sent her to the window where she waited for him to cross the courtyard. He didn't, but if he had, she would have called, "David!" and throwed him a pack of Yankee Doodles. The apartment consisted of 4 good-sized rooms with flaking plaster walls, spackled regularly by Ben, and parquet floors that rose slightly and annoyingly beside 2 of the door sills. Once a month, Marian really took the place apart and waxed and buffed the floors. And at least once a month, Ben, in stocking feet, would slip, grab onto the back of a crushed velvet wing chair, and say, "Jesus Christ!" The building itself was old, situated on a wide and busy boulevard in Queens, lined with supermarkets, bars, hamburger chains, and several Chinese and Italian restaurants specializing in takeout orders. A popular firehouse was 2 blocks away, and the LaGuardia landing pattern directly overhead. The neighborhood was young, married couples, primarily, and singles in the newer buildings, older people and chiropractors in the others. And the Rolfs, Ben, Marian, and David, who had been hunting there and living there for 4 years at $160 a month. A bargain. And $30 less than their previous and first apartment, a crammed 3 farther out in Queens. In the great tradition, they left seeking space, just as many of the young couples would eventually leave this neighborhood and resettle in small houses out in Nassau or Suffolk. The Rolfes as well. Marian was sure they were just a few years behind. 4 years ago, they discovered that a small 3 could no longer contain what 5 years of marriage had accumulated. Especially marriage to Marian, who was, by her own admission, somewhat acquisitive, or as Ben once put it in an infrequent rage, a goddamn pack rat. And so rather than walk sideways with an occasional crouch to get from room to room, they moved. To space and economy and convenience. The building was large and, God knows, lively, filled with pregnant women, small children who yelled in hallways, and big children who scrawled obscenities in the elevator when the elevator was running, with cooking odors and an old man who actually peed under the mailboxes, hammering radiators, dubious plumbing, with a roach problem and, on one unspeakable occasion, a mouse problem. It was minimally superintended by a polygynous black, Mr. Ives, who was usually referred to just as the Phantom. Each year, 3D seemed less of a bargain, at least to Marian, who spent most of her time in the apartment. 3 or 4 times a year she would sign up with office temporaries to help pay for some new and irresistible buy, a French provincial buffet, or her proudest possession, a mahogany and bronze doré desk. Along around May, faced with the prospect of the summer, she would become moody, testy. She spent a good part of her time cleaning the apartment, and the cleaning went on and on again and again. "Christ," Ben said, "it's Dunsinane all over." When he explained the reference, she hit him. Instead of listening therapeutically to Ben's pre-dinner complaints about Mr. Byron, the high school principal, or the dumb kids, or Miss Mackenzie, the Crichton who headed Tilden's English department, Marian would counter with a litany of her own, tickling off the heat, the noise and the soot, the sameness, the landlocked and the god-awful boredom of the city in summer. City. Hell. Queens. Space, economy, convenience? They became irrelevant from June to September, when the apartment, as far as she was concerned, became uninhabitable completely. Why not do it just once? Spread the dust covers, leave the key with Aunt Elizabeth, and head for someplace cool and quiet. Or anything and quiet. There was always office temporaries in September. She had dusted just a couple of hours ago, and already there was a layer of soot on the windowsill in their bedroom, yet again. She lifted the curtains, blew along the length of the double sill until she felt an ache under her ears, and slid the windows down. The wall of windows and white brick faced their bedroom as well as the other rooms, and the supervisor, Marian noticed, was at her post, overlooking the scene in the courtyard. A huge woman filling a 4th-floor window. She was always there. It seemed like some bulbous gargoyle leaning on a pillow and staring impassively. Ben insisted she was a household god and naked from the waist down. Marian added private to someplace cool and quiet. Just a little bit of privacy. To be able to make love maybe once without closing the windows and lowering the shades, or worrying about the beds on the other side of the wall, the floor, the ceiling. She did anyway. Ben couldn't care less. They made love with the lights on, and once something in the apartment above was hitting the floor with the plaster splinting thud, had sent the shade rattling up while they were at it, exposing them to the wall of lighted windows. I feel like a dirty joke, she had told Ben when he climbed back into bed. He laughed like hell. She turned over and went to sleep, which shut him up. All right, maybe she was exaggerating, for emphasis, like an overdone room in a department store. Maybe it wasn't so bad after all, though probably it was. Just a month, 2 months away, and she was sure she'd come back refreshed. The galloping paranoia checked for the next 9 months. She had looked over the real estate section of the Times yesterday, reading the most likely prospects aloud to Ben, who grunted noncommittally at each. She hadn't pressed it. Sunday the summer seemed less threatening. Today it was real, within earshot, and was that on the button. And the possibility of spending it in Queens with maybe 2 weeks upstate, an occasional trip to Jones Beach or Bear Mountain more unsupportable. Ben was free all summer. No courses, no summer teaching. David was free. She was nothing but free. And they weren't exactly broke. She nodded to herself, convinced, and went into the living room. The piano's hammering was directly below. She bent over the magazine rack and pulled out the Times, which was open at vacation and leisure homes. Once again, she ran her eyes down the columns, concentrating on the vague prospects she had circled yesterday. Jerking off, Ben called it. Soon she didn't even hear the clinkers. Bus stop. Hydrant. Driveway. The goddamn area was getting worse than Manhattan. There had been 2 spaces on the boulevard, both of them with meters, and one on 39th, too small for the Camaro. He had gone around the block twice, had tried some of the side streets whose one-way signs took him farther away from the apartment. 10 minutes ago, he had passed his building, which was now buried somewhere between the range of Carlton Towers and Gibson Arms and Maybury Heights. Who the hell was Carlton and Gibson? Where was this lousy Heights? And why 4 days out of 5 did parking and dinky yellow compact assume such Wagnerian proportions? The light in front of him turned red. Ben bagged his attaché case beside him, said, "Shit!" and reached for a cigarette. A jet roared above the spiny trees that were already in full leaf. Coming toward him were 4 or 5 boys, David's age, on bikes. They stopped pedaling at the intersection, one of them gliding into the cross street and swerving suddenly to avoid a car, which fortunately had been traveling slowly. Ben grimaced and then shook his head. Bike lecture tonight. The teacher in him would have shouted something at the boys, the runty one especially, but 50 feet ahead on the side of the road, someone was getting into a parked car. He looked at the light nervously, at the menacing cars coming toward him, and the sneaky bastard cruising down the side streets toward the green light. Come on! Light, change! The woman got into her car. Her backup light glowed. There was movement, and in a clumsy bumping movement there was the beginning of space. Ben inched the Camaro forward. The light changed, and as far as he was concerned, there was a God after all. By the time he reached the luncheonette across the street from his building, Ben had forgotten where he had parked the car 10 minutes before. The realization had come to him when his mind unbidden, a sudden twinge like a nudge in the ribs and a small, mischievous voice saying, "All right, wise guy, now where'd you put it?" He picked up a Post and pack of cigarettes, paid the old lady who never smiled, and left the luncheonette, glancing at the headlines. He waited at the corner for the light to change, and while he knew exactly where the car was, he mentally retraced his route just to fix it in his mind. Straight 2 blocks, a right to the left to the next light, and bingo. He looked at the lead story. New York was on the brink again, read a boring paragraph about budget cuts, and stopped. There were 3 lights, actually. 2 he made and 1 he stopped at. The kid on the bike, Davy's age. Christ, this was stupid. He knew where he parked the damn thing. He folded the paper and slipped it under his arm. A bus lumbered by, close to the curb. He turned away from the exhaust fumes, shifting his attaché case to his left hand, and pulled his tie looser. The thought persisted, grating, trivial. He tried to dismiss it, to think about something more important: the fiscal crisis, noise, corruption in high places, traffic, pollution, the looming, ugly heap of stone across the street. What kind of place was this to raise a kid? Nassau, Suffolk, there were alternatives, weren't there? Maybe even Rockland, or farther upstate. Marion was right. The city became less appealing every day and more abrasive. Maybe they should start thinking about it seriously. That was important, much more important than the fact that, yes, he lost the goddamn car. Well, should he look for it now or wait until morning? Leave the house 15 minutes earlier and wander the streets like some absent-minded idiot he obviously was? He shifted his attaché case to his right hand. His jacket was sticking to him. A transistor was blaring nearby, and someone was going horn-happy behind a car making an illegal turn. A part of his mind was turned off, asleep, and the sounds were working on him like a piece of undigested food. Tension, it's called. Hell, the things in his day, the frustrating, petty, stupid annoyances he could really get worked up over. How long before it snaps, he wondered, before the sensible piece of his mind says, "I've had it, Sonny. You're on your own." Break up and flies up like a balloon. Going. He drew a deep breath, tracing its flights over his building, puffed out his cheeks, and made a small popping sound. The little girl he just noticed waiting next to him on the curb looked up at him. "Smile, honey." He repeated the sound effect for her, more elaborately, and in the time she brought her hands up to her mouth and giggled. "Hi," he said. "What you got in the bag?" "Ring-dings," she said after a moment, and giggled again. "What's a ring-dings?" "Cake," she said, and Ben heard "idiot" in the subtext. The light changed, and the little girl ran across the street on her long, skinny legs. On the opposite corner, he stopped just briefly, drew one final blank when he decided was absurd and wasn't going to bother him at all right now, and walked toward the building entrance. He nodded a bright "ladies" to a cluster of old women on camp chairs beside the entrances, gossiping and watching traffic. In the vestibule, which smelled of cabbage, he met Mr. Girolamo, who had a heart attack last year and now spent most of his time waiting for the mailman. Mr. Girolamo asked whether it was hot enough for him, and Ben said sure was, and how was he feeling these days? Just fine. The elevator, he added, had been repaired that morning. Well, let's see what goes next, Ben said, and Mr. Girolamo, who was 60 and looked 80, laughed tentatively. Mary had changed from jeans and her faded work shirt to a light blue blouse, the color of her eyes, and a red denim skirt. She was in front of the bathroom mirror, pulling a comb through her hair. Somewhere in the D line, a toilet was being flushed, and behind the flowered shower curtain was a slow, steady drip, staining the porcelain blue. The sound had long ago become part of the ambiance. She was scarcely aware of them. The comb wisped through her hair, long downward strokes. She stopped, leaned closer to the mirror, and turned her face to the right a bit. She brushed her temple with one finger, separated the strands. 4 cylindrical lamps had been fixed over the mirror. Ben's Operation Sal's ear. She adjusted one of them, a white, not a pink, and aimed it at the side of her head. False alarm. She readjusted the lamp. 30 plus, she said in the mirror. Face it. She washed off her comb and wiped the pink marble counter. Theirs, not the building's. Placed some quick checks with the colored bottles and tubes and the jars of display soap. When she heard the key in the lock, she brushed a few strands of her hair from her shoulder and turned off the lights. The room smelled of lilacs. Me, Ben called. When she came into the living room, he was checking the mail and tossing it aside. She put her arms on his shoulder, said, "Hi, baby," and kissed him. She could see the newspaper with her markings beside the phone on the desk. He hadn't noticed. "Ugh, it is hot," Ben said, moving away from her. He stopped in the middle of the room and sniffed. "The place smells of lemon oil." "I've been a really busy girl," she said. "How about a beer?" He said fine and growled, "Ugh," very expertly at the sound of the piano under his feet. When she left the room, he was snapping and growling louder. She went into the kitchen, which had a small dining area in front of the window, hung with bright summery curtains. The vinyl floor, a rose pebble pattern, gleamed. Marian took 2 beers from the refrigerator and then reached into the old-fashioned glass pane cabinet. She had painted the panes bright green for glasses. Any minute now, he'd see the newspaper with all those suspicious-looking phone numbers and checked and crossed out ads. Should she have made the calls or waited? Too late now. She poured the beers in front of a large pegboard hung with shiny copper pots. "I can't take it," Ben called suddenly from the living room. His voice rose to a parody of a yell. I can't take it." She looked toward the sound, and before she could say anything, the copper pots began to tremble and ring. The whole apartment was shaking, the floor in the kitchen throbbing. There was a muffled thud, thud, thud coming from the living room, a tinkle of glass. "My God!" she cried Ben. She rushed into the living room and saw Ben bouncing up and down on the rug, right above the sound of the piano. The lamps were shaking. A porcelain figure was sliding close to the edge of the end table. She grabbed it, looked fearfully around the room, and shouted, "You're crazy! Stop it, Ben! Stop it!" He gave one last heel-together jump and stopped at the piano, began to limp under him. "Listen," he whispered. "I think it worked." "You're absolutely mad. Nuts." She moved around the room, straightened the pictures and sconces, checked the lamps and bowls and figurines and vases, and filled all the polished surfaces. "I whooped it good," he said. "The piano stopped." Very funny. Very funny. Surprisingly, there was no damage. Her panicky look softened into a helpless, reluctant smile. She shook her head. "You idiot." "Where's my beer?" he said, dropping onto the couch. When she came back with the beers, the piano started up again, a resonant as before. Ben threw up his hand. "It's got to be a conspiracy. The whole fucking bloody city is after my ass." He patted the cushion beside him. Marian handed him his glass, took off 2 coasters, and settled beside him. "You face her now," she said, nodding at the floor. "Let that old bitch worry about facing me." He took a sip. "She'll think you did it. That's what I'll tell her anyway. You would, wouldn't you?" "It's every man for himself, sister." "Hey," she said after a pause, "I've got a great idea." "Yeah." "Let's move." He smiled, staring into space, and pulled her closer to him. He had unbuttoned his shirt. She played with the seam and slipped her hand inside, rubbing his hairy chest, which was hard and damp. "There's no one down there, you know," she said confidently. "Just a piano playing itself. And feet above us that run back and forth. No real people, just resonant sounds." She walked with her fingers up his chest. He settled deeper into the couch, touching the wall with the back of his hand. "Unwinding?" she asked. "Ugh, getting there." He gave a long sigh, then lifted his feet onto the coffee table. Marian leaned forward and moved the cut glass cigarette box. "I ever tell you about my last breakdown?" he asked. "No." "Remind me sometime." She nodded. "Always something new to find out, even after 9 years. Is that what they mean by the adventure of marriage?" His hand moved to her knee, which he stroked lightly. He was staring, expressionless, at a small crack in the ceiling. She could see beyond his profile the windows of the neighboring building. A figure in striped drawers was moving in one of the apartments. "So how'd it go today?" she said finally. "Or shouldn't I ask?" "You shouldn't, but you did," he said lazily. "How it always goes." The kids were bright, responsive, on fire, all of them. Then to top it all, a faculty meeting that for sheer heart-pounding excitement. He belched, and she said, "Pig." He turned to face her, and the smile was innocent and vulnerable, and whether he was over the hill as he claimed or not, she still found it irresistible. "You know something," he said, "I don't like what I'm doing very much." He said as though it had come as a revelation to him. "You always say that this time of year, and I always mean it. A month to go, right? You'll survive." "Not this time, baby. I'm cracking." He sat up and looked at her sideways and announced, "I lost the car." "What? How'd you manage that?" He told her. She laughed, and he failed to see what she found so funny. "It's a sign, you know." He made the sound of something large collapsing. He was great with sound effects. "You mean—" She pointed to the side of her head and twirled her forefinger. His mind seemed, and his mood seemed to have changed suddenly, and instead of a reply in a kind, vigorous nod of his head, he reached for a cigarette quietly. "About time you caught up with the rest of us," she said, but Ben only half heard her, distracted by something. The piano, the children screaming, playing under the windows, or the beer. Beer worked on him quicker than wine. He seldom drank anything stronger. "Hey," she said, nudging him, and whatever part of him had left the room came back. He said, "Hi. I've got the answer to all our problems," she announced, brightly. "Flight." She sprang up on the word, saying as she crossed the room, "Now don't yell, just listen." She looked back. He was lighting his cigarette. She lifted the paper and a green beanbag ashtray from the desk and carried them back to the couch. When he saw the newspaper, he let his chin drop to his chest wearily. He exhaled a balloon of smoke, and Marian could see stars, spirals, and exclamation points in the mows. "Shut up," she said. She placed the ashtray in front of him, even though there was another one, delicately frilled Bellic, on the end table beside him. Ben waited for her to settle onto the floor in front of him. Her position became suppliant. He said, stentorian. "Listen," she poked him, clearing her throat, and read, "Unique summer home, restful, secluded, perfect for large families, pool, private beach, dock." He laughed. "Listen," she read on, "long season, very reasonable for the right people." The italics were hers. "Racist pigs," he said. "That's not what they mean." She held the paper out to him like a particular ripe tomato. 2.5 hours from the city. What could be more perfect? "What city?" he asked. "Warsaw." "New York, dummy. And very reasonable, huh?" "That's what it says." Ben put his cigarette down, brushed the paper aside, and grabbed both her hand, pressing them into an even more suppliant position. "Honey," he said, "that desk was reasonable, remember?" He nodded at the antique desk where his papers were, and some of his books. The kitchen table was where he actually worked. What's that got to do with it? A lesson in semantics, the decline and fall of meaning. "Oh, stop. We're not in your crummy classroom." "Lucky us," he went on, careful to keep it light and without any note of reproach. "The breakfast was reasonable, so they had told me, and the fancy chairs. Bergères, the end tables, the lamps, the tchotchkes, the Christ knows what you have stashed in our closets. Reasonable, or some parody of the word, had left us with roughly 2,000 in the bank after 9 years. That's probably 2,000 more than a lot of people have," she said. "Why are you foaming at the mouth, for God's sake?" "Because a house with a bench and a pool and a dock is not going to be reasonable nowadays. Now that's what we call nipping in the bud." "Ben J. negative. All the time you're negative." "We can't swing a summer place, honey." He brought her hands up and down, keeping time with the words. The newspaper fell below them, scrawled with telephone numbers and doodles. "What's wrong with 2 weeks upstate? 3 weeks if you want." She said, "Ugh," and pulled her hands away. For a long, between-round moment they looked at each other. Marian with an exaggerated pout that would make him feel hopelessly cruel and unreasonable. "Benji," she whispered, moving closer to him, "why be such a shit?" She crept between his legs and pressed her face against his chest. Her hair brushed his arm. He let her maneuver herself into position. Then, "I get it," he said. "Get what?" He could feel the words against his chest. Your tits and ass get up. You're trying to seduce me into it. Would I do anything so cheap and transparent? She hugged him tightly. We could at least look, couldn't we? Just to prove how right you are and smart and level-headed. She looked up at his chin. Her expression, if he could see it, was one of helpless guilt. I did, after all, call them. You called them? He repeated calmly. These sweet little gingerbread people who are so reasonable. They're expecting us. What? When? Saturday, she asked. His silence encouraged her. Just think, Benji, a lovely ride over the grasslands, a picnic lunch with all your favorite yummies. Don't make me a liar. Just say yes, please, please. No. But of course he got along with her, just as he had for the past several years. He mouthed the words, offered an obligatory protest, and she reacted antiphonally. They start with the reasonable $1,000 a month beach cottages and work their way down to the jerry-built lakefront cabins or the bungalow colonies with their tribes of screaming kids and 5-day widow queens transplanted. Cots, rickety furniture, dimestone landscapes on the wall, and bare wooden walls. And they were always damp and gritty with sand. He could just see Marion in a setting in like that. But the fantasy kept persisting. She was silent, waiting for him to relent, and he could feel a sly, sneaky touch inside the leg of his trousers. Oh, I suppose, he said finally, there are worse ways to spend a Saturday. She smiled, but with no hint of triumph. The voice was vaguely repentant. You're not mad, are you, about the calls? I should have waited, I know, but you can be, and I love this in you. I really, truly love it. You can be so impossibly negative at times. She brought her face level with his. It could be so good for us. Oh, honey, no worrying about Davy and the damn bike, or me for that matter, wondering whether you'll find me here or splattered on the pavement below if I have to spend another summer in this bin. I'm not mad. Oh, that's my Benji. He shifted position a little uncomfortably. What however, is something close to horny. Unless you want to give all the folks yonder a real hot show. He was sliding back up on the couch, freeing himself from Marion, who looked quickly in the direction of the open window. The supervisor was still at her perch, fat-breasted pillows on the sill, below her the courtyard, continuing to war. Besides, he said with a small chuckle, we don't have a car anymore. Remember? And as he sat up, the piano below thundered to an off-key climax, and the name Marbury Heights came into his mind, and the building half a block away from it on Wood Avenue where he parked the Camaro, absolutely, no questionably, in front of the large lobby window. He remembered very clearly the plastic fern, the lamp, and the chair inside, all of them chained to the wall.